Is it just my age, or were there moments into tonight's presentation where the Spirit spoke pretty strongly about the importance of temples and the opportunity that we're going to have as a state to be guided in an experience that's second to none by tremendous leaders? You know, as Sister Schupple was speaking of her experience on the bike, I was reminded that when we called them into the office to ask if they would accept this assignment, they showed up and she had a big back brace on and was having, you know, not an easy time navigating, and came in and sat on the chair rather uncomfortably with this big back brace on. And we looked at each other and thought, what are we doing? We're calling this invalid to be a track master here. It took about 3 seconds to figure out that that wasn't the case at all, because even with the back brace on and recovering from that serious accident, they were walking 5 miles every morning, and Brother Schupple assured me, nope, she makes me walk with her 5 miles every morning, she can do this. And I know she can. We owe the Schupples a great debt of gratitude, and I know many of you have been helpful, so it's not their show alone, but they certainly have brought to us an incredibly inspired program. You know, as I thought about what I might talk about tonight, I think I boiled it down to just maybe giving you some personal examples of what the St. George Temple means in my life. And I would start by telling you the story of my grandparents, George A. and Della Mae Topham. They met, they were married in the St. George Temple, June 28th in 1916. They met in Paraguna, Utah. My grandmother, Della Mae Smith, at the time was a resident of Cedar City. She was visiting one of her married sisters in Paraguna when she met my grandfather, George A. Topham. My grandmother was a smith. Her father was a sheep rancher, and they owned a lot of property on the top of Cedar Mountain where they spent the summers with the sheep. Hauling a load of wood down the mountain, not unlike hauling the wood from Mount Trumbull to the St. George Temple, the horses ran away, failed to negotiate one of the S curves on Cedar Mountain, plunged over the side, and her mother, my grandmother's mother, with her, my grandmother in her arms, a tiny infant just months old, went over the cliff, realizing she couldn't get herself free because her dress was caught in the axle of the wagon she was seated on, with a huge load of wood behind her. She threw my grandmother into a bush, where she was later found unharmed. At 23 years old, her mother was impaled by the load of wood and was killed instantly. She grew up with her sister, with family members, her aunt and uncle in Canaryville. They met and married, and I would share with you just a few things taken from their family history, their personal histories. Penn Barton and his car were hired to take George and Della, along with Joe Robinson and Zola Robb, from Paraguna to St. George, where they were to be married. Penn's wife went along as a chaperone. The group stayed in the Rye Orton Hotel, but sleep that night was out of question. It was far too hot in St. George, and there were hundreds of small frogs hopping around. I don't see the hundreds of small frogs anymore, but there were hundreds of small frogs hopping around all over the lawn, so we couldn't even come outside of the hotel. But the next day they were married in the temple in St. George. for time and for all eternity. That, of course, was after going back to get Della's recommend, which she left in the hotel, a nervous bride. They spent their wedding night at Anderson's Ranch on the way back to Paragouna. We now call it Anderson Junction. It's where you can turn off to go to Toberville between St. George and Cedar City. There was a dance hall there and a hotel at one time. There's the remnants of a dance hall still there. That was their honeymoon, Anderson Junction. And then home to Paragouna, Utah. My mother's parents, William Clare and Roberta Crowley, also married May 3rd, 1921, in the St. George Temple. George and Della raised a family with 2 girls and 3 boys. 4 boys, and 3 after the war. 4 boys, they lost 1 during World War II. My Uncle Dewey was captured by the Germans and was placed on a death march, Bataan Death March, similar to the Bataan Death March. He was rescued toward the end of the war. My father, who was also serving in the European theater of World War II, was able to travel to Reims, France, and visit him in Paris, France, from Reims, and visit him in the hospital. But the doctors informed him that the rescue had come much too late, and that he had only a matter of days to live. My father got to spend those few days with him, hearing stories about prisoners killing each other over the dandelions that came up in the spring in order to have nourishment to survive. Prisoners who couldn't keep up being shot, discarded by the German soldiers. So many stories. Such a sad life. A life lost with a girlfriend back home, a fiance really, who was waiting to be married to him in the temple. Since he didn't return, my father was able to stand in proxy for him and for his fiancée, and they were, in fact, even after his death, married for time and for all eternity in the temple. My own parents, in the St. George Temple, my own parents were married in the St. George Temple shortly after the conclusion of World War II and his return home. They're both 88 years old, both still alive, and both with still vivid recollections of the opportunity they had after a year of civil marriage to travel to St. George and to be married there for time and all eternity in the Lord's temple. My wife and I were married in 1971, right about the time the crust of the earth was cooling, and in the St. George Temple. Since then, we both were endowed there. I was endowed for my mission. She was endowed before our wedding. We were both endowed in the St. George Temple. We're married there. We have 6 children, 3 girls and 3 boys. All have been endowed in the St. George Temple. 5 have been married in the St. George Temple. The other one will be at the point of the gun soon. We are examples of the blessings that came from the pioneers that sacrificed so much to build the St. George Temple. Extreme heat in summer, bitter cold spells in the winter, drought for many, many, many months, followed by floods that made it almost impossible to get timber across the Virgin River. Mosquitoes, ticks, vectors of malaria, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and so many other diseases They endured because they knew the importance of the temple to them and to us. Every one of us have had our lives blessed because of the saints who endured so much to construct the temple, which you saw tonight in this meeting constructed. There is nothing that I enjoy more than rubbing shoulders with the young people. I love the young people of this day. I am so excited for them to have this tremendous opportunity. I know it will build testimonies. I know it will reinforce commitments. I know that you will make promises and commitments to yourself that you will keep as you also benefit from those early pioneers who suffered so much to build this temple, so that you, each one of you, could be endowed with all that your Father in heaven has, because that's what you receive in your endowment, all that your Father in heaven has. And then, at some point in your life, find a mate and be married there for time and all eternity. The temple has and will continue to be the blessing in all of our lives that's incomprehensible in nature. I bear testimony to you of the fact that when we're faithful to the covenants that we keep in the temple, we have the opportunity to return home to our Father in heaven. We cannot get there any other way. I testify to that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.